Over the last several weeks, we've been looking into a variety of different Bigfoot-related legends from across the country. And I guess you could say that our goal here is to determine who is the sassiest Squatch. I'm Aiden Mattis, and welcome back to the Lore Lodge. In the previous episode of this series, we took a look at some various Bigfoot-like legends from around the North American continent. These included the Yurok Indian Devil, the Algonquin Wendigo, the Cherokee Tsul'kalu', and something that goes by a few different names from the Klamath Reservation. Klamath Reservation Councilwoman Taylor Tupper described their version of Bigfoot as a sort of keeper of the forest that went by three names, and these were in the different languages of the Klamath tribes. There is the Modoc Matakagmi, the Klamath, I'm going to try my best here, Ye Ahya Has, and the Yahuskin Paiute Si-Te-Cah. And that last one, as you may have guessed if you've been around here for a while, struck me as a little bit odd. And not in the least because Si-Te-Cah does not mean keeper of the forest in the Paiute language, but because this is also the term typically applied to the cannibalistic red-headed giants of Lovelock Cave, Nevada. But while we're on the topic of different languages having different words for the same thing, I think we should probably introduce you to our partner for today's video, Babbel. Back when I was a younger man who didn't have facial hair, I was actually pretty solid at German. I wasn't quite fluent, but I was proficient enough that I felt I could have a conversation in the language without completely embarrassing myself, which of course is something that can never happen if you're in France because they will simply make fun of you no matter how good you are. But the point is, I could ask you how to use the bathroom, how to get to the train station, I could even order ice cream, and now I can't. And unfortunately, it's quite a lot of effort to go find a local community center or a college or something like that where I can just go and take a simple German course for, not thousands and thousands of dollars. What I need is something that I can interact with on my own time, on my own terms, to learn the stuff that I feel like I will need should I go to visit the country. And to do that, I found that Babbel was a great tool. Babbel teaches real-world conversations. Lessons are going to prepare you for how to have practical conversations about anything from travel and business to relationships and simple pleasure. And depending on your needs, there are a few different subscription tiers with Babbel, including a lifetime one. Mit Babbel konnte ich sofort wieder Deutsch sprechen. Ich kann dich fragen, wo die Toilette ist oder was für ein Eis du möchtest. Auch ich kann singen, 99 Kriegsmeister, Streitholz und Benzinkanister, hielten sich für schlaue Leute, wirteten schon fette Beute. To be fair, I'm not sure that Goldfinger got their German correct either, but we're trying our best here. So, whether you're starting off from scratch with a language you do not speak, or trying to warm yourself back up with something that you once spoke, Babbel is a great option, and you can get 60% off your subscription using the link in the description. Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world, and we highly recommend that you give it a shot. And if you do, please feel free to leave a comment letting us know what language you're going with. In fact, if you do that, please tell us how to say keeper of the forest in the language you decided to learn, because I couldn't figure out how to say it in Paiute. With that in mind, the first thing I want to address when it comes to the Si-Te-Cah is actually the very naming of these beings, or this legend in general. I also would like to mention that while this will go over everything that we need to cover for this video's topic and this general series, we do also have a two-part series on the Giants of Lovelock Cave on this channel from back in September of 2023 if you want to check that out. That goes into some more detail on the archaeological findings, the lore behind the story, all of that. But here we're going to talk specifically about those red-haired giants. Now, one of the most glossed over aspects of the entire Si-Te-Cah story is that most of the research, most of the work around Lovelock Cave was conducted in the 1910s and 20s by a museum security guard named Llewellyn L. Loud. Now, Loud was assigned this task by the anthropologist Alfred Kreber, who is considered one of the godfathers of American anthropology, so it's not like he was, some random dude going out to a site, but he was not a properly trained archaeologist by any stretch. And it is from Loud's work that we get the term Si-Te-Cah. Thing is, that is neither a Paiute word, nor is it actually the word used by Llewellyn Loud. He gives us a word that's more like Se-Du-Cah. And according to him, the Se or Sai means tule, and the Du-Cah means eaters, because the Paiute would often refer to each other's bands by what they ate. So you might have the cattail eaters, and the fish eaters, and the ground squirrel eaters. To that end, I'm unsure why Taylor Tupper seemed to be saying that this term meant keepers of the forest, but she's not wrong about there being Bigfoot connections in the Si-Te-Cah story. And in Loud's retelling of these events, they were known for kidnapping women, just like the Yurok Indian Devil. And another thing is that while Loud identified the Se-Du-Cah as being just another Northern Paiute band, or possibly a band from a different tribal group, the Northern Paiute do have a different term for these people, Numic. And what that word, or phrase I should say, means is people eaters. One of the most detailed accounts that we have of the Si-Te-Cah comes through Sarah Winnemucca, a Paiute woman born in 1844 and the daughter of a Shoshone Paiute chieftain by the name of Winnemucca. And according to Sarah's 1882 book, Life Among the Paiute, at some point in the past, many hundreds of years ago, her people lived in fear of a tribe of barbarians who lived along the Humboldt River about 40 miles to the east of her people. She said that these barbarians would ambush, kill, and even eat Northern Paiute travelers, and that they were fans, you might say, of using pit traps with spikes in them, and they would place these along paths that were frequently traveled by the Northern Paiute at night. She also said that if they couldn't get themselves some nice, fresh Paiute steaks for dinner, then they were, willing to dig up and eat their own dead. In some cases, they would fight full-scale wars against the Paiute, in which she said that they fought without fear and displayed these amazing feats of agility, such as jumping into the air, catching arrows, and then turning around to throw them back at the Paiute. According to Sarah Winnemucca, at other times, times of peace, the Paiute would either intermarry or adopt members of these Si-Te-Cah into their own tribe to try and civilize them, to try and say, hey, give up your cannibal ways, come be normal people like us and eat fish. Her people were actually the Quiwi-Takata, who were at Pyramid Lake. They were fish eaters. Unfortunately, these Si-Te-Cah, these Numic, whatever term you want to use for this tribe of barbarians, they refused to integrate. They would simply just go back to their wild cannibalistic ways, which again sounds a little bit like the Yurok Indian Devil. The result of this failure to integrate was that the Paiute eventually just waged a war of extermination against the Si-Te-Cah Numic barbarian group. This lasted for 3 years, and eventually the barbarians were driven back to Humboldt Lake, where they hopped onto some tule rafts and paddled out into the middle of the water. Eventually, however, they started to run out of food, they really had no shelter, there's no way to dispose of waste, so they had to make their way back to the shore. And in some versions of this story, you have them getting attacked as they land, sometimes you have stories about them drowning, but the core here is that at least some of them made it out of the lake, onto the east shore, and then, snuck their way up to Lovelock Cave. There, they were besieged yet again, and Sarah's pretty clear that anytime somebody tried to escape from the cave, either to get water or dispose of waste, her people would just shoot them with bows. She goes on to say that multiple times they called out to these people who spoke the Paiute language, even if it wasn't theirs, but it's very clear from her account that she is under the impression that these people spoke the Paiute language, at least in addition to their own. But even though they could understand that they were being asked, not really asked, they were being ordered to give up their cannibalistic ways, and they would be allowed to live, they still refused to do so. They would not come out and say, you know what, we renounce the cannibalism, we're going vegan. Eventually, the Paiute decided that they were just going to pile up brush, it's sagebrush they say, and then stack it at the entrance to the cave, light it on fire, and smoke them out. Still, the barbarians did not leave their cave, and so far as she is concerned, this was the end of that tribe. They were exterminated, they were gone, there was nowhere they could have escaped, but nobody came out of the cave. And Sarah says that after this, her people were known as Se-Du-Cah, which meant something along the lines of conqueror or enemy. That part of the story is largely up for debate. Nobody's really sure why she said that, and it doesn't appear that anybody did call them Se-Du-Cah, or that Si-Te-Cah meant conqueror. I tried to find it, I looked it up in some Paiute dictionaries, and I couldn't find anything to corroborate this. And before we go any further, I just want to make a slight correction to something that I had said in our September series on the Si-Te-Cah, which was that Si-Te-Cah cannot possibly mean Thule eaters. And that's because, in theory, it actually could. I had said this because I couldn't find an example in any of the dictionaries of a word similar to say or sigh, something along those lines, meaning Thule. So they couldn't have been Thule eaters because there was no Sai word for Thule. And also, there was a Thule cattail eaters tribe that was like Si-Te-Cah or something like that. However, deeper in Loud's work, a Gilbert Natchez, a nephew of Sarah Winnemucca, gave Llewellyn Loud the names of a few plants. And the word that Gilbert Natchez gave for Thule was say or sigh. I can't corroborate this with any dictionaries, as I said, but I had to note that there was a Paiute man who did tell Llewellyn L. Loud, hey, this word means this thing. And while I did say that Sarah Winnemucca has one of the more detailed accounts, and one of the, I guess, closest to the source accounts that you can come up with, there are other ones. For example, Llewellyn Loud spoke to a John T. Reed, who passed along a story which he said had been told to him by a Captain Natchez, who was a brother of Sarah Winnemucca, and this was back in 1887. Captain Natchez's story mostly matches up, mostly follows the same, general plot points, but he does offer a couple of differences, one of which is that these people lived along the Carson River, not the Humboldt River, and he also says that surrender was never an option. They never told them, hey, if you change your ways, you can come out and you can live like us. It seems that the intention was extinction from the beginning. And while Sarah had given a time frame of many hundreds of years ago, she had also given a time frame of her third to fifth grandfather's time. And Natchez also seems to sort of echo this. He says that this happened, 4 or 5 generations back, so at most 125, 150 years. This would place these events sometime during the 1730s to the 1750s. Another account passed along by Reed came from an Annie Lowry, a half-Paiute woman he had spoken to, who said that this was more of an issue of food scarcity and the kidnapping of women for wives for marriage than it was anything to do with cannibalism. But in another more direct, if much later account, and what I mean by that is it came from the Paiute, not from people talking to the Paiute, comes from the Lovelock Paiute tribe, who actually still to this day inhabit the Lovelock, Nevada area. According to the Our History section of their website, the Lovelock Paiute, or the Coop-Te-Cutta, the ground squirrel eaters, fought a tribe of what they call strange Indians who were very tall and had red hair all over their bodies. And they called these strangers Numa-Te-Cutta, people eaters, after their habit of cannibalism. And what you may notice is that over and over again, we're seeing that these are people that are not referred to as Si-Te-Cah or Si-Te-Cah by the actual Paiute themselves. So you may be noticing the same thing that I noticed. Over and over again, the term used for these people is Numa-Te-Cutta, or barbarians, or man-eaters, so where exactly did Si-Te-Cah come from? We know that it seems to derive from Si-Te-Cah, but that word in and of itself is really hard to define. And somewhat painfully, the 1906 edition of the Handbook of American Indians does identify a tribe in eastern Oregon as the Si-Te-Cah. That tribe is the Yahuskan Paiute, who Taylor Tupper said refer to Bigfoot as Si-Te-Cah. But it should also be said that the Lovelock story isn't the only Paiute legend involving some race of man-eaters. This is because certain parts of their mythology do tell about a time when cannibals roamed, and one of them was particularly feared. He was called Numuzoho. Numuzoho was known to grind up his victims, who were frequently fully grown human beings, in a giant mortar and pestle, and of course his name means people pounder. In addition to this, it's said that he was a big man, though no particular size is given. It's just said that he was, bigger than us. It also isn't particularly clear from the various stories that I was able to dig up whether or not Numuzoho is a particular cannibal or the name for the race of cannibals. Either one seems to be equally possible here. In one account given by a Billy Steve, who was also a member of Sarah Winnemucca's Pyramid Lake Paiute or Kwi-Wi-Te-Cutta tribe, Numuzoho visits a village, and he approaches from the south. And as for time frame for this story, it's never explicitly stated, but it's sometime between the flood and the last, 1,000 or so years. Basically, it happens at some point during the Holocene period. But as Numuzoho, or this particular one of the cannibals, travels, it's said that he says, "We moho moho moho," and a woman who lives off on her own, away from the village, hears him coming. So she goes to tell the rest of the band, the tribe, and she says, "Hey, the cannibal is coming. I hear him. He's saying, 'We moho moho moho.'" Now, the people of the village are all too busy doing their own thing. Some versions of the story say that they were playing some sort of gambling game. Others just say that they were, working and performing their daily duties, and they just didn't believe her that this guy was coming. So, unable to convince anybody, she goes back to her own camp. She finds either a grain pit or a menstruation hut. It's unclear. It just says that it's a hole in the ground away from everything else. And she just goes in there and she hides. Soon after this, Numuzoho arrives at the village, peeks his head into, the main building where everybody's sort of gathered, congregated, hanging out, and he goes, "Psst, psst, psst, shut your eyes dry," which somehow kills everybody. In this account that I was reading, the interpreter even said that it must have some sort of magical meaning, that it's something that would have made sense to the people who originally recorded the story, but it's lost its meaning through time. It's obscure. However, there is one survivor of this attack, and that is an infant who was at the back of the room taking a nap behind its mom. Now, Numuzoho doesn't even realize that the infant has survived because he doesn't bother to eat any of these people. He just went in and felt like killing an entire village worth of people. So this woman, who is referred to as Old Mother in some of the retellings, she goes and she rescues this sole surviving baby, and she goes off into the wilderness. And her intention here is to go and find a husband, and she had been told about a man who lived on a mountain and had lots of meat, and this was all that was required for him to be desirable. Yeah, don't we all wish that it was as simple as living on a mountain with lots of meat? According to some of the sources, this mountaintop he lived on was Job Peak, east of Fallon, Nevada. Now, the next few plot points vary from version to version, but they are thematically consistent. Basically, what that means is that the characters change slightly, maybe specific bits of dialogue change a little bit, but for the most part, the main beats of the story are the same. The first thing is that while in the wild, she sets up camp, she sets the baby down, and she goes looking for some food. She's trying to figure out how they're going to survive this journey. During this outing, in some way or another, the cannibal discovers her and the child and is diverted away to go eat the baby. Some versions say that she encounters the cannibal and tells him where the baby is. Some versions say that the cannibal hears the baby crying and goes directly to it. Again, changes from version to version. This is actually extremely common with oral legends because the specific storyteller would often, add, subtract, depending on what the story was about and who the audience was. In any case, after the cannibal goes after the child, she takes that opportunity to go and look for a place to hide. And she comes across the home of Beaver, who is alternately identified in certain tellings as just an old grandmother or an old woman who takes her in. This character lives with the cannibal tribe, by the way, but just is not a cannibal herself. She takes the woman from the village that had been attacked by the cannibal in, she hides her from the cannibals, and then, eventually, she sends her on her way. Depending on the version, sometimes we get some more details here. For example, Billy Steves says that the cannibals carried fire in the tips of their fingers, but he doesn't go on to explain what that means. It feels like them being people carrying pistols would make sense, but this story is supposed to take place many, many, many years ago. This is a story that actually, in the end, is about the creation of the Northern Paiute tribes and how they came to be. So this story is at least 500 years in the past, if not much further, so it can't be pistols. In any case, she does eventually make it to the mountain, having been chased by cannibals all along the way, where she meets the man and they begin a short courtship ritual, which, in the Paiute tradition, meant that they would sleep on opposite sides of the hut the first night, and then each night the man would move closer, essentially asking permission, is it okay for me to get closer and closer and closer, until eventually, once the permission has been given for her to sleep next to each other, they consummate the marriage. I'm not sure if that was how the Paiute did things by Sarah Winnemucca's time, but that is how the story goes in this case. The man and the woman then have children. In some accounts, they have two pairs, a boy and a girl in each pair, who become the Paiute and the Pit River. And then in other versions, they have many, many, many children, all of whom become the various Paiute tribes. You may notice a sort of biblical parallel here to the story of Noah's sons and how they each went off and formed their nations. In both versions, however, whether it's two pairs of children or numerous tribes, the children begin to fight one another, so the father figure sends them all away from their home, which is on the Carson Sink, to go and form their own nations, their own tribes, their own bands off in the world. And this is what creates the Paiute Nation. In one account, recorded by anthropologists Jack and Catherine Fowler, one group was sent to Humboldt Lake where they fought against the Si-Te-Cah, who are identified as the Nez Perce. And in this case, they're not annihilated. They're not just, exterminated. They are actually just driven off. I am a little hesitant to draw any direct conclusions from the Fowler material, because it seems like what they did was gather a whole bunch of stories and then summarize what they said, rather than giving you each story on its own. I also noticed that they identify a group called the Si-Te-Cah and the Si-Te-Cah as different tribes, which seems a little odd to me. It seems more likely that these are the name of the same tribe in different dialects of the Northern Paiute language, but I could be wrong about that. In most of the traditional accounts that I was able to find, there are two different tribes here that come out of this. It is the Paiute and it is the Pit River. And there's no specific mention of the Si-Te-Cah unless you're identifying them with Beavers people. Several of the traditional versions recorded by Robert Lowy in 1924 do identify the non-Paiute group as being the one that is sent to Lovelock or Humboldt. And one of Lowy's sources does say that this non-Paiute group was called the Si-Te-Cah, and that they were driven to a cave, burned out of the cave, and then that they escaped elsewhere. And since in most accounts, Beaver's tribe is there long before these Si-Te-Cah or Si-Te-Cah, any of the people sort of identified as who the Paiute fought at Lovelock Cave, it seems unlikely that Beaver's people are the Si-Te-Cah. These seem to be two different groups that were mixed into one. Essentially, if Sarah Winnemucca identified Beaver's tribe with these Tule Eaters or Willow Eaters of Lovelock Cave, that could be how the cannibalism worked its way into the Si-Te-Cah story, and it could be how Si-Te-Cah or Si-Te-Cah became associated with man-eaters. So what I really want to focus on when it comes to the Si-Te-Cah is not the Battle of Lovelock Cave that supposedly happened a few hundred years ago. I want to focus in on those giant humanoids roaming around eating people. Because, while the eating people isn't necessarily part of it, the idea of giant humans roaming around the mountains, who the average-sized humans are scared of, is not isolated to Lovelock, Nevada. In fact, it shows up in the work of a J.W. Burns up in British Columbia in 1929, and I want to start there for this next segment. J.W. Burns was a Canadian Indian agent and educator who lived and worked on the Chehalis Reservation up near Vancouver from 1925 to 1941, and then switched over to the nearby Squaw Reservation from 1941 to 1945. These reservations were and still are very close to one another, and both belong to tribes that speak a Salishan language dialect called Halkomelem. Archaeological evidence suggests that these communities have been in British Columbia for between 5,000 and 10,000 years, and possibly even earlier than that. And what's also very interesting is that they seem to have lived in settled villages for at least the last 4,000 years, which is actually very early for Native American societies. And during his time amongst the Chehalis people, J.W. Burns took the opportunity to learn some things about these legends that he kept hearing of big, hairy men living out in the mountains that seemed to be told by native and frontiersmen alike. He recorded 3 specific stories told to him by natives of the region. Specifically, these were a Chehalis man named Peter Williams, a Squaw man by the name of Charlie Victor, and a man named Point from the village of Agassiz. And all 3 told him tales of what their people called Sasq'ets, or, in translation, roughly, hairy men. And Burns retold these stories in a 1929 article in Maclean's magazine entitled Introducing BC's Hairy Giants. And the article begins by introducing the subject matter and describing how reports from time to time, covering a period of many years, have come from the hinterlands of the province that hairy giants had been occasionally seen by Indian and white trappers in the mountain fastnesses, far from the pathways of civilization. And he laments at how vague the research has been on this, and how nobody has been willing to come forward to admit that they have seen this in person and to describe it, which might be something of a little white lie to get people reading the article, as there's been a lot of first-hand accounts of these big hairy men from before that, but that's beside the point. We'll be getting to that in another video, don't worry. And he also notes how the elders, fearing that they would be mocked for sharing these experiences, didn't want to talk to European Americans about it, or European Canadians, because according to them, the white man don't listen, he make joke of the Indian. But not all of the natives agreed with this sentiment. For example, Peter Williams of the Chehalis Reservation. He told Burns a rather harrowing tale of his encounter, or encounters I should say, with these hairy giant people. Peter's first story took place in 1909, and he said that he was out hunting at the foot of a mountain about a mile from the Chehalis Reservation when he heard this strange grunt off to the side. He turned to look and saw what at first he thought was a large bear, but as he raised his rifle to shoot it, it stood up on two legs and turned around to face him. It then let out a piercing yell, leapt down from its boulder, and began to chase Peter, who immediately just booked it. Peter then ran for his canoe, which was sitting in the Chehalis River, while this 6'6" tall, giant, hairy dude is just chasing him the whole way, and gaining. In the limited time Peter had to, look at the thing and gauge how big it was and all of that, he estimated that it was about 6 feet 6 inches tall, which is not particularly impossible, but that is the kind of height that you notice out and about. I don't think I would look at a person who's 6 foot 6 inches tall and go, that's a giant, but I would say, wow, that is a big person. And that is clearly the way Peter thought about this, because he just ran as fast as he could for his canoe, which was sitting at the edge of the Chehalis River, and he got in, pushed himself across, got out, and started running for home yet again. And of course, as he gets into the water, he thinks, oh, well, it won't follow me through here, clearly. But no, our friend the Sasq'ets just started wading right through after him. So, of course, Peter's like, yeah, I can't just stay out here, there's a big man following me. So he runs back to his own home, barricades the door, tells his wife and kids, hey, hide under the bed, something's coming, let daddy deal with it. And about 20 minutes after he arrives home and barricades the door and sets up for his home defense session, he hears the sound as loud as the trampling of a horse coming from outside. Peter told J.W. Burns that as it approached, he looked through a crack in the wall of his home and saw that the figure approaching him, this 6 foot 6 inch tall being, was about, double the breadth of a normal man and covered in hair. But aside from that, he said it just looked like a normal human being. But human or not, the attacker started to bash against the walls of Peter's home so aggressively that it actually rocked back and forth, but it just couldn't quite get through. It then spent quite a while grunting and growling and moving about like an animal before eventually walking off. In the morning, when he went out to look around, he found the thing's footprints, which he said were humanoid in shape, but about 22 inches long and rather narrow. The following winter, while duck hunting on the north side of Harrison Lake at a place that the natives called the Prairie, Peter had his second encounter with the hairy man. It once again chased him, but this time it gave up after a few hundred yards, perhaps remembering that last time Peter had actually evaded it. That possibility is actually strengthened by the tale of another person who allegedly, this came through Peter as well, but this other guy, Paul, supposedly had a run-in with the same hairy man later that day, but as he approached his own cabin, it decided to break off the chase, which does suggest that this is something that is intelligent enough to recognize, hey, when they get inside their buildings, they're safe from me. I don't need to waste effort. After his second run-in with the Sasq'ets, for some reason or another, Peter was questioned by the elders, and he said that they just kind of nodded sagely and, knew what it was. They basically told Peter, yeah, that's the Sasq'ets, don't go near those. Also, we're not going to draw attention to this. As for why they didn't want to draw attention to the issue, probably ties back to that same thing that J.W. Burns heard. The white man don't believe the Indian, he make joke. Peter did see Sasq'ets twice more in his life, once while out bear hunting with a companion, and once while fishing with his wife. During the bear hunt, he actually saw two of them, one male, one female, and he said that they were nude. Thankfully, neither of them gave chase this time. Then, while he was fishing with his wife, he actually did see the one that had chased him a couple of times before, but thankfully it did not see him and just kind of wandered off into the wilderness. Finally, Peter told Burns that Peter's father had told him stories of wild men living off in the mountains and how, some of them still live off near Agassiz. But he was very clear that these creatures of the mountains, these hairy men, were in no way related to his people, to the Indians, as he said. He said these are not Indians. Burns also spoke to a man by the name of Charlie Victor over at the Squaw Reservation, and he clarified that Charlie Victor was known as one of the best hunters in his band in his youth. And Charlie had two main stories of the Sasq'ets. One was about their home, and then the other was about their mannerisms and social behaviors. And according to J.W. Burns' article, he used the term Sasquatch. That's what he called them. And he described them as a strange people of whom there are but very few now, rarely seen and seldom met. In the first of Charlie's stories, he and some companions were out picking salmon berries on a mountain slope, a rocky mountain slope, 5 or 6 miles from the old town of Yale, as he says. And this is possibly Mount Fagervik. While there, they came across a large opening or cave in the mountainside, and they felt this was odd because they had been picking berries and hunting and trapping and all of that on these mountainsides for their entire lives, for many years. They knew these places like the back of their hands, and they had never seen that cave before. And Charlie said, outside the mouth of the cave, there was an enormous boulder. We peered into the cavity, but couldn't see anything. So they gathered wood to make some torches and made their way into the cavern, at which point they discovered that not all that far in seemed to be an enclosure or perhaps a house made out of stone. It was crude, but it did look to be man-made. And they wanted to keep exploring and figure out, what's going on here, what is this, but their torches kept going out, so they decided, you know what, we'll leave and we'll come back another time better prepared. But upon hearing this, the elders went back to Charlie and his friends and they said, hey, you can't go back there. That's surely the lair of the Sasquatch. You cannot be there. But Charlie and his buddies, being young men who just discovered a Sasquatch cave, which is something they didn't even know existed up until that point, they decided they were going back. However, when they returned, they found that enormous boulder, which he had said was, it looked almost too perfectly round, like it was meant to be used as a door or something. Well, he was right, because that boulder was rolled in front of the cave entrance and they couldn't get back in. Now, Charlie didn't want to give up on the cave thing entirely, and he expressed to Burns that if he ever had the money, he would have loved to go back and bring dynamite to blow it open and really explore in there and figure out what was going on. And I think at the beginning of this I said that there were 2 stories that Charlie had. There's actually 3. So this is the next one, which took place 20 years after the cave incident. He was bathing one day in a small lake near Yale with some other people when he just, out of the corner of his eye, saw something behind a rock. He stared at it for a second, and then he watched as a big, hairy man sort of just crept out from behind the rock, looked at him, and then walked away. Charlie said that its eyes were so kind-looking that he was actually going to speak to it. He wanted to say something, but then it just sort of wandered off. 2 weeks later, he and some others were doing the same thing, just hanging out at the lake, when they once again saw the hairy man off in the woods, but this time, rather than getting close and, making eye contact with any of them, it just ran off toward the mountain. And when he says the mountain, I kind of assume contextually that he means the one where he saw the opening in the wall. The third experience that Charlie recounted happened about 15 years before he spoke to J.W. Burns, so we're going to talk about probably 1914 here. And Charlie described this experience as a disagreeable meeting and a tragedy from which he had not yet fully recovered. He was out hunting in the mountains near Hatzik when he came upon a plateau covered in large cedar trees. And at one of these cedar trees, his dog alerted, so it walked over and it was pawing at it and essentially asking, hey. Charlie was curious why the dog was so interested in this tree, and he looked up and found that about 7 feet up, there was a large hole. And so he put the dog into the hole. It's not clear exactly what kind of dog this is, or what kind of hunting method this is, but I'm not going to question it because I honestly don't know enough about hunting to do so. After a moment, he heard a muffled cry and then some scuffling around and assumed that the dog had found a bear. So he called the dog out, hoping that the bear would follow it, and he would just be waiting there with his rifle to take the shot. The dog proceeded to drive out what Charlie Victor assumed was a small bear and promptly shot. But when he looked at what he had shot, it turned out that, in fact, it appeared to be a 12 or 14-year-old boy. This boy was nude, he appeared to have white skin, like European white skin, and he had woolly black hair. Before Charlie could do anything, the boy let out a wild yell, which Charlie said, was as if he were appealing for help, and a booming voice responded from across the mountain. The boy would continue calling, and he would continue getting a response, but each response was slightly closer than the last. And after less than half an hour, according to Charlie, a hairy creature walked out of the forest and approached him without the slightest fear. And whatever this creature in front of him was, he could tell immediately that it was female, that its skin appeared to be dark, and that it had long, straight hair which cascaded down to its waist. Charlie estimated that the wild woman he was seeing was about 6 feet tall, and aside from being rather hairy, she looked normal for a human with one main exception. She was unusually broad in the chest and shoulders. Charlie also told Burns that he had seen several wild men in his life, but this one was by far the most savage in appearance, and upon seeing it, he was genuinely in fear for his life. The old native even continued, saying, "In my time, I have in more than one emergency strangled a bear with my hands, but I'm sure that if that wild woman laid hands on me, she'd break every bone in my body." Now, I know that there are some of you who in the comments will write something along the lines of Bigfoot muscle mommy. And you know what? Go ahead. In any case, the wild woman then turned to Charlie and spoke, and he was very surprised to find that he completely understood what she was saying. He said that she spoke the language of the Douglas people, an interior Salish group, who are local or were local to the area at the northern end of Harrison Lake. Charlie himself was half Douglas, or more properly, the Hawkshaw people, so he knew the language well enough to converse, and what she said to him was, "You have shot my friend." Charlie was immediately apologetic, saying, "I'm sorry, it was an accident, I thought he was a bear," all because he's looking at the wild woman and he felt fear at the anger he saw in her face. I would imagine that fear only intensified because she didn't actually respond. She just started to dance in a circle around the boy, shouting out a chant and the word Yahoo repeatedly, all while taking what appeared to be some form of rope. He thought that maybe it was made of animal intestines, that was about 6 feet long, and whacking it on the ground as she danced around the boy. And all through this performance, as she's chanting Yahoo, Yahoo, he's hearing other voices chanting from the forest, Yahoo, Yahoo. Then she just picked the boy up like he was a little wax doll and carried him. And Charlie said that as she picked the boy up and got ready to walk away, she said, "Siwash, you will never kill another bear." And Charlie, for the rest of his life, did not kill another bear. In fact, he never shot another animal. And he says that as this all happened, as she was, saying goodbye and all of that, he just got this sudden wave of exhaustion, and he couldn't even hold his rifle up. He just, kind of lost all of his energy. He was paralyzed with fear. Now, as for that term Siwash that the wild person used when it spoke to Charlie, I found a few different definitions. The one from dictionary.com, which is the one that I'm going to trust the most here, says that it has two essential meanings, one of which is a disparaging term for an indigenous American person. And from what I was seeing, the term came out of Chinook jargon. It came out of a sort of a mixed language of European languages like English and French, and the Pacific Northwest Native American languages. This came about as a result of trade between all of these different groups who needed to understand each other. And it seems that it came from the French sauvage, which I guess in context meant wild. As a verb, however, the word means to camp without a tent or supplies, basically wild camping. In addition to that, there is a Siwash Creek north of Yale, British Columbia, along the Fraser River, so it could have been in reference to that. But, as I said, I was unable to be certain about this term, but it seems like it's probably relevant to the story in some way or another. For example, if this wild person was using the Chinook jargon terminology, if they were calling him, a derogatory term for a Native American, well, that would imply that it wasn't a Native American, that it was something else, someone who viewed these people as others, and someone who at least viewed this specific one negatively. Charlie also said that this wild person was darker skinned than the ones he had encountered previously, and that looking at the very white-skinned boy, he figured that that boy probably was not one of them, and was either kidnapped or adopted, acquired in some way or another from a different group, and they were raising him as one of their own. And of course she had called the boy friend rather than son or child or something like that, implying a non-familial connection. However, it was Charlie's opinion that because these guys spoke the Douglas language, they must be in some form or another related to the Douglas people. I guess it is possible that the word Siwash meant something different in the Douglas language, but then why not translate it as he did the rest of the sentence? It seems that he very intentionally put that word there. And I know I'm harping on it. I don't particularly know why he would have done this. But again, I know that some people in the audience know more about certain topics than I do, so if any of you do, please let me know your thoughts on that. And the last of Burns' informants was a man who simply went by the name of Point. He had lived in the village of Agassiz, which is where this encounter had happened, and he said that it happened in 1927, 2 years before Burns' article came out. It was the end of September, and the village was preparing for an annual hops harvest festival. They would have a feast every year to celebrate this harvest. Point said that he was walking with a girl by the name of Adeline August through her father's orchard, which he said was located about 4 miles from the hop fields and along the Canadian Pacific Railway tracks. And Adeline was the first to notice that something was coming towards them walking along the tracks, and at first she thought, oh, well, that's just a person coming towards Agassiz, they're probably going to be participating in the festival, that's all. But as they got closer and closer, about within 50 feet, they realized that something was off about this person. The man was naked and covered in hair, quote, like an animal, and most importantly, he was twice as big as the average man, with hands so long they almost touched the ground. Point also said that the thing's face was a little different from ours, that the nose was very broad, covering much of the face, and that the eyes were very large. Point said that at first he and Adeline were both paralyzed with fear, but then they quickly came to their senses and bolted towards the village. However, the giant, whatever it was, didn't chase them, it just kinda wandered off back towards the mountains. And of course, when they went to tell the elders what they had seen, and it was more that they were just telling the story out in the open and some of the elders heard, they said that Point had clearly run into one of the Sasq'ets, and that those were a tribe of hairy people who the elders claim have always lived in the mountains in tunnels and caves. So what we see is that in each Sasq'ets story recounted by Burns, the elders are well aware that these things exist, that they live in caves, and that they advise people not to go near them. And in each story, the Sasq'ets only seem to become violent when threatened or provoked. Peter Williams raised a rifle at one, Charlie Victor shot one of their friends, and Point, who did not in any way provoke the thing, it just left him alone. Of course, Burns is not the only person who has described the Bigfoot-like lore of the Sasq'ets of the Salish peoples, but unfortunately, the other academic and journalistic sources are extraordinarily limited. That said, according to S. Michel Rasmus, the Salishan Lumi people of Washington have stories of what they call Semiquets, or big bones. Unfortunately, Rasmus tells us literally nothing about these legends besides the fact that they vary from storyteller to storyteller. I won't go into why she does that, but it's something that really bugs me about modern academics, especially in history. Then, in a BBC article entitled The True Origin of Sasquatch by Elisa Cadane, Chehalis Band Council member Kelsey Charlie is quoted as giving his explanation of the Sasquatch legend. He says that the name derives from Sasq'ets Tell, which is where the Sasq'ets or Sasquatch gather, and that everybody paid reverence to the emblem of our nation, which is the Sasquatch. This does contradict the accounts given by Burns in some ways, and he goes on to describe Sasquatch a little bit differently. He says that this is a sort of shapeshifter, and it's a spiritual being who protects the forest. But he also says that at one point he saw some of them drinking from the creek or from the lake. So it's, I guess, spiritual beings, shapeshifters, more than a singular figure. Or possibly there are two different Bigfoot here. There are two different Sasquatch, one that is a spiritual being and one that is a tribe of Wildmen. Or we're just getting two different sources and only one of them is right. And because accounts from the early contact period, when these stories had the greatest amount of integrity to what they originally were, because those sources are so vague, it's really hard to determine who's correct. On the one hand, Kelsey Charlie is himself a member of a Salishan band. He grew up on these stories, and you'd expect him to know his stuff. However, as we saw with the stuff that Taylor Tupper said, where she talked about Nakani, who I could only find in one account from a guy who was by no means a Native American, and the fact that she said Si-Te-Cah was what the Paiute called these people, I have to point out that just because you're part of a culture doesn't necessarily mean that you're always going to know all of the details about what people who lived before you believed. I mean, just look at the way that Irish Americans and Irish people celebrate St. Patrick's Day and how they conceive of being Irish. There are, growing up in a culture does not necessarily mean that you fully understand all aspects of it. Many of you who watch the channel are probably Christian, but I bet you couldn't recite the Gospels. It's the same kind of thing. Generally, you want to listen and you want to understand and you want to bring that information in and seriously consider it, but it's important to not leave oral legend, oral storytelling at its face value. You should always look to compare and contrast sources from every angle so that you get the most complete picture. And the reason I say that is because, on the other hand, J.W. Burns lived amongst these people. He learned specifically about these stories. He was targeting this. He was, what is this? Tell me about this specific thing. Explain this aspect of your lore to me. And, the guy was trained as some form of educator. So it is possible that J.W. Burns, with access to those people telling him these stories directly from a much earlier time period, could have the better information. As I said, it's really difficult to ascertain who is more correct here because of the lack of records. So what we can do is look at the surrounding area and the tribes that are not Salishan themselves, the ones that are simply related, or perhaps ones that are Salishan but from a different region. Because a lot of their stories do fall in line with this Sasq'ets as Sasquatch as Wildman idea. One example of that would be the Alutiiq Nantiinaq. I first came across the Nantiinaq legend while I was researching for our video on Portlock, Alaska. And yes, we do have a video about the abandonment of Portlock, Alaska. Now, the Alutiiq have lived on the southern coast and islands of Alaska for about the last 7,500 years, if not longer. And they have some stories of this half-man, half-beast thing that lurks out in the wilderness. Now, if you've seen the TV show Alaskan Killer Bigfoot, or you've seen our coverage of the abandonment of Portlock, Alaska, you probably are aware that Portlock, which was, a town of less than 100 people, and home to a cannery site, just kind of overnight, and by overnight I mean over the course of a couple of years, but very rapidly was completely abandoned, became a ghost town, back in the late 1940s. And the suggestion has been that there were all of these weird things that were happening, that people were dying, that, there was something stalking miners and loggers and fishermen. And whatever this thing was that was killing people, it was the reason that Portlock was abandoned. Or at least that's how the conspiracy theory, if you might call it that, goes. But we do have some people who were there, who actually experienced this, who have told their stories, and one of them was a millennia Helen Kell, who in 2009 sat down for an interview with a Naomi Clouda of the Homer Tribune. Then the oldest living resident of a village called Nantiinaq on the Kenai Peninsula, Melania was born in Portlock on January 25th, 1934, but her family relocated while she was still a young child. And speaking in her native Sugstan language, Melania told Naomi that her parents chose to leave Portlock not because of the economic conditions or anything like that, but because something was terrorizing the village. In one anecdote that she gave from 1941, Melania said that her godfather, a man by the name of Andrew Kamluk, was logging when something, a large piece, a very heavy piece of logging equipment, struck him in the head and killed him instantly. Nobody saw it happen, and it would have been very difficult for somebody to just casually lift this up and hit somebody with it. And then another source included in the same article is a Simeon Kvasnikov, who gave a tale of a gold miner who went missing, and the man allegedly just disappeared while walking to work one day. He was never found. And his disappearance was attributed by Simeon to the Nantiinaq. Yet another story, this one from a man who simply went by Ed while posting on an online forum, took place in 1990, and he said that he was transporting a 70-ish-year-old Native American man from a prison to the hospital. Ed was a paramedic. On the way, they talked about hunting, and Ed mentioned Dogfish Bay, at which point the old Native man sat bolt upright, grabbed him by the shirt, and said, "Did it bother you?" Ed answered saying that it had, but he hadn't seen it. The Native man responded saying that while he himself hadn't seen it, his older brother claimed to. And he said that his brother had also said that it had chased him. And this got Ed thinking about his own encounter back in 1973 when he and two friends were up that way bow hunting. After they ate dinner, cleaned up, turned in for the night, Ed was awoken around 2 a.m. by his friend Dennis. Dennis said that he had heard footsteps outside creeping around their tent in a semicircle, and when Ed looked over at the other man in the tent, Joe, he was already armed with a rifle. Yes, I know that they were bow hunting, but they might have brought a rifle along for self-defense purposes. This makes sense, I promise. They sat in silence, just listening, as whatever was outside just continued to stalk around their tent. But what they thought was most interesting about this was that A, it seemed like whatever it was walking on two legs, and B, when they went to check in the morning, they saw no tracks. Now, all of those stories came from that 2009 Homer Tribune article, but there are other sources, other papers, other magazines that do include stories about Portlock, Alaska, and the witnesses who were there. One of those was an Alaska Magazine article from 2016, which listed a few more of these stories. A Tom Larson, interviewed in 1981 for a high schooler's school project, talked about how he was born in Stavanger, Norway in 1899, came to Alaska in 1925, and after bouncing around Juneau and Anchorage for about 15 years, he bought a sawmill in Portlock. So that places his arrival and opening of his business in Portlock around 1940. And as we know, Melania Helen Kell's godfather, Andrew Kamluk, was allegedly killed at a logging facility. So these could very well be the same place. And of course, Mr. Larson's main client was the Portlock cannery. So his business was directly connected to and essentially, survived via the canning industry. And while chopping wood one day, he claimed that he saw a large, hairy figure on the beach, and, in fear of whatever he was seeing, ran home to grab his rifle. But when he returned and aimed it at the creature, he just couldn't bring himself to pull the trigger. He just stared at it, they made eye contact, and then he just couldn't do it, and he didn't really seem to know why. Now, in addition to all of that, author Robert Dolitzal, who passed through the area in 1973 and spent an evening in English Bay or Nantiinaq, he spent the night with a school teacher and his wife, and they swapped stories. He told them about his adventures around Alaska, and they told him about things they had heard about Portlock. He summarized their stories. He didn't give a ton of details, but what he said was that in the 1940s, rumors began to creep through the Kenai Peninsula that something was off about the village of Portlock. People were telling tales about hunters who never came back, about giant footprints seen by railroad tracks, and of course there were the dismembered bodies in the lagoon. And then Portlock was just abandoned by 1951, about half a century after the town had been founded in the first place. And the truth is, not everybody who's looked at the Portlock story has found that to be entirely odd. Darren Smith, writing for Anchorage Press in 2021, spoke to a Russo Aleut woman by the name of Sally Ash, who was born in Dogfish Bay and was the cousin and translator for Melania Kell in that 2009 interview with the Homer Tribune. And she said that they didn't leave Portlock because it was dangerous, because they were being stalked by some sort of Bigfoot creature. She said they left Portlock because of economic conditions, because the church community was moving away and the jobs were moving away. Essentially, the place simply was not providing the kind of income families needed to thrive, so they left. In her version of things, Melania Kell was simply tired of reporters asking the question, hey, what happened to Portlock? So she made up a nice juicy story about, Bigfoot taking people out so that people would stop asking simply because they weren't, down with the whole economic conditions reason. Now, in our video dedicated to this case, we go into the details of why I don't necessarily believe that. The chief reason is that a lot of the other accounts we have are from before 2009, and they say much the same thing as Melania Kell. And we're talking about stuff published in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We're not talking about stuff that was published in the 2010s. So clearly, people writing prior to Melania Kell were writing about this. We're saying, hey, I experienced this thing. But we go into more detail in the Portlock video itself, so I suggest watching that. And I should say that Melania Kell's story does not equate to there is no Nantiinaq at all. Sally Ash wasn't saying this thing doesn't exist. She was just saying it's not responsible for the abandonment of Portlock. It didn't kill anybody. Now, of course, some of the other stories from earlier say that it killed people, but that's beside the point. But Sally explained that her people were traditionally semi-nomadic, and as they followed food seasonally, they would often pass by Portlock after its abandonment. She did say that it was always sort of a creepy place, and that they were, not ordered, but it was suggested to people that they don't go out on foggy days. And that, this suggestion may have been for fear of the half-man, half-beast Nantiinaq. And throughout this article and interview, Sally does sort of refer to the Nantiinaq both as a singular and a plural. She herself believed that the Nantiinaq was the Nantiinaq, that there was a single solitary creature that lived near Portlock that was this being. However, at other times, she implies that there's more than one, and has said things like there are very few of them left, or any that remained went off into the mountains. So maybe she's saying that there's one specific one that's the Nantiinaq of Portlock, but that this is some sort of broader group as well. It's a little hard to tell. I would place the blame for that more on the journalist than I would on the storyteller, because it's very clear that he did not provide any sort of... Darren Smith doesn't provide a full transcript of the interview, he just gives you quotes. So there may be information she provided that explains this that simply didn't make it into the final cut of the article. And it's also fair to mention that Sally herself said that she had never seen the thing, but that her brother had at one point come across it. He said that he had been out at a lake and that he had brought his skiff up onto the bank, and he smelled something that was just awful. And in trying to figure out what it was, he peered between some reeds, and in there, he saw what he described as a very hairy man with his hands backwards. Basically, I guess like that. He also explained that she herself thinks that Nantiinaq, if it's a single individual, is very old, and she gives her mother's account, her mother's description, of a tall, strong, hairy, and foul-smelling being who lived near Dogfish Bay. She also suggests that whatever Nantiinaq is now, it was part human, but it didn't want to be around people, so he went into the woods and became very hairy and terrifying, which, honestly, relatable. I too wish to go into the woods and become very hairy and terrifying. And that language is interesting. Became hairy and terrifying. Because at another point in the story, she does say that the Nantiinaq is a shapeshifter, and that whatever this thing is, if you chase it, well, as soon as it gets a chance, it will transform into something as small as a mouse and just disappear. And it wouldn't even have to really disappear. It would just go from being a large hairy man thing to a mouse, and you would never be any the wiser. She also warned that shooting one would not harm it, because it would simply take the bullet right out of its chest and continue on its way. As for what became of the remaining Nantiinaq, and yes, again, she at this point implies that there are multiple, she said that they had retreated to the interior, living in the mountains far from civilized society, which does sound a little similar, especially given the geographic location, to something else that we've covered. We recently covered the Valley of Headless Men, or in its official capacity, the Nakani National Park Preserve. And of course, associated with that story are these legends of what the Dene call Nakani, or Naka. The Decho sometimes describe these things as monstrous, but most of the time, they're depicted as wild men living amongst the crags and canyons of the Nahanni River Valley. Or you might make the argument that these people could roam across the entirety of the Mackenzie Mountains. Little is ever said about their appearance, as these Naka or Nakani were almost never seen, but I did find one description that suggested they were ragged-looking, and one person described them as a Cree half-breed with a beard, or at least had the appearance of a Cree half-breed with a beard. And it was said that these guys would emerge as the foliage returned. They would come down from the mountains into the lowlands once they could actually be easily concealed within the brush. And then in the winter, they would live up in the mountains, underground, and just survive off of stored food. I remember one thing that I read said that they could only ever be known because you would see fire coming out of a hole in the ground. And you might look at it and say, oh, this is just a bedtime story. This is something that they say to kids to keep them from running off into the hills. But in 1876, the missionary Emile Petito wrote that each year during the summer, a fear spreads among them in an epidemic and irrational fashion. They live at that time in continued terror, in fear of an imaginary enemy who pursues them without rest, and who they believe to be everywhere even though he does not exist at all. So this suggests that it's not just, a fairy tale told to children like Rumpelstiltskin. This isn't, hey, if you leave your tooth under your pillow, then the tooth fairy will come get it. This is something that even adults were seriously afraid of. Even into the 20th century, fear of these Nakani persisted amongst the Decho people, and one famous example is the Frank Henderson expedition of 1946, which hit the papers because Frank Henderson went in with a partner and came out without one. Henderson and his partner Jack Patterson entered the Nahanni River Valley from two opposite directions, one from the southeast, one from the northwest, and they intended to rendezvous at Virginia Falls, about the midpoint between their two entries. If one party arrived before the other, they were to leave a message saying where they had gone, and then they were simply to wait there for the other to get there. When Henderson arrived, there was no message from Patterson, so he left his own, saying that he was going to be camping down in Dead Men's Valley, where the McLeod brothers had been found, 30 years earlier, and he just sat down to wait. But after several weeks, Jack Patterson still had not appeared, so Henderson gathered up his companions, who were, as far as I can tell, all Native American guides. So he gathers them up, he brings them up to Virginia Falls, and they realize that there's no sign that Patterson's been there yet. So they set up camp at Virginia Falls and wait a few days. Still no sign of Patterson, and a few days in, the natives start to get a little restless. They began to complain that at night they would see white figures moving around in the valley, what they believed to be some sort of, aggressor, some sort of predator, something that they were worried was going to harm them. And Henderson, well, he thought it was just a trick of the light. Now, I think we can agree that after the context we provided in the Nahanni River Valley video, the Valley of Headless Men video, and the stuff we've talked about tonight, these are probably the Nakani that they're worried about. They are seeing these white figures moving around down there. They don't know them. They've referred to these people as painted Indians in the past. That's probably what they were scared of. Henderson, on the other hand, put no stock in this whatsoever and wanted to continue. He just could not persuade his companions. So they all said goodbye, and then Henderson hiked out a little while later on his own. Unfortunately, that's most of what we have on the specific Nakani idea. I did talk a little bit more in the Valley of Headless Men video about some academic opinions on this, the idea that this may have grown out of a fear of, Russian or Cree spies. But there are other accounts that come from other Dene groups to the north, and one specifically from the Quichin. And if we have anybody who knows how to pronounce that word properly, please tell me, because I looked it up and could not find a good example of an actual person saying it. And before I go into what I'm about to say, I do want to say that I did find these sources via Hammerson Peters, but I also read them myself. Credit where it's due, I did use Hammerson Peters to find these sources, but I did my own analysis of what they said. The reason I say all of that is because one of the sources I used was the British adventurer Michael H. Mason, who talked about what he referred to as the devils of the Gwich'in of the Yukon, and he talked about these things that they call Mahoney. According to him, this is presented by another explorer, another anthropologist figure, as Nahanni, but he says, in his experience speaking to these people, they pronounced it with an M. Anyway, he describes them as a race of terrible wild men with red eyes and of enormous height, completely covered in long hair. He also writes that they lived without fires and ate human flesh whenever possible, striking down from their homes in the Ogilvie Mountains, just west of the Mackenzies, and by extension, the Nahanni. Oh, and he has the detail that their footprints were allegedly 3 feet long. Now, this is certainly much more monstrous a description than that given by the Decho Dene, who did not include cannibalism in any of the versions that I was able to find. However, I did find another somewhat familiar aspect of the Bigfoot mythos within that Decho story. The Nakani were said to come down and kidnap women and children, which we see in a lot of these other Bigfoot legends from across North America. And one reason that you might do this if you were a small isolated tribe up in the mountains is to prevent inbreeding. It would be to, promote genetic diversity within a community that is geographically isolated. There's also the fact that the term Nakani is extraordinarily similar to the term Nahanni. And in this Dene language, the H and K, the sounds that those letters make, can be very similar. So this means that there could be a connection between these Naka and the mysterious vanishing tribe of the Naha of the same area. You see, to the Algonquin Cree on the eastern border of the Decho, Nahanni simply meant the people of the West, but to the Decho, it referred much more specifically, in the form of Naha, to a very violent tribe of barbarians who lived up in the mountains. Decho Grand Chief Herb Norwegian told Parks Canada that the Naha were nomads who inhabited the Mackenzie Mountains for hundreds of years, and that they became a great Dene tribe, a powerful Dene tribe. But just because they were powerful doesn't mean that they were well-liked, and they were known to come down and raid during the summer. They would come out of their mountain fastnesses, they would take supplies, they would take people, and they would just go back up for winter. And because of this, the Decho got together and they said, you know what, something needs to be done. We have to get rid of these Naha. We must conquer them once and for all. So they gathered together this coalition of warriors, they go up into the mountains, they arrive at the Naha main village, and it's empty. There's nobody there. The fires are still going in some versions of this story. The bedrolls are still out. In others, it's more like, it looked like they had been gone a little while. But fact of the matter is, important part here, they're gone. They left. The entire tribe disappeared. So, these stories aren't exact matches for one another, but they do bear some similar characteristics. We have violent mountain tribes who raid during the summer, seem able to vanish into thin air, and had remarkably similar names. And of course, the remarkably similar names point is something I'm careful with, because just because two things are cognate doesn't mean that they share an ancestry or that they even mean the same thing, but these are two things within the same language. And they refer to the same geographic region and similar subjects. It's a little too close to ignore. But here's where it all gets really crazy, because the Decho story ends with the Naha just sort of melting into the hills. However, history bears the record of at least one Dene migration between 1200 and 800 years ago. These migrations resulted in two distinct colonies, you might say, of Dene speakers. One down in the American Southwest, the Four Corners region, the Dene, the very well-known Navajo and Apache, and the other up on the Pacific Northwest coast. These were the lesser-known Pacific Coast Athabascan. And interestingly enough, a few of those Pacific Coast Athabascan tribes, specifically the Hupa, Cholula, and Whilkut, were neighbors of Lucy Thompson's people, the Yurok. And seems that they were there for a while. They appear to have migrated into the region around 1000 AD. Now, all three of these Dene-speaking bands or tribes maintained Dene languages, but the Hupa and the Cholula, being very geographically close with the Yurok, intermingled quite a bit. They took on certain religious aspects, they intermarried, and in large part, there was some syncretism going on. The Whilkut, on the other hand, were a little bit more isolated up in the mountains and the furthest south away from the Yurok. And what precisely divided the Whilkut from their Hupa and Cholula cousins is uncertain, but the anthropologist Alfred Kreber wrote that the Hupa viewed the Cholula as kinsmen, while the Whilkut they regarded as potential enemies. Despite this, the Whilkut would have been not much of a threat. There were only a few hundred of them living up in their mountain homes in the canyons around Redwood Creek. How much of a threat they would have been anyway isn't really clear. There were only about 500 of them, and they were living in these very simple bark slab houses up, in the canyons around Redwood Creek. Now, if you'll recall from the previous video on this topic, Lucy Thompson gave a very specific location for the cave that the woman Si-Te-Cah, who was kidnapped by the Indian devils and taken to their homes in the mountains, she gives a pretty specific location for where that cave is. She says that it's at the headwaters of Redwood Creek. Now, just a quick refresher on the previous video, these Indian devils that Lucy talked about, the thing they were most known for, most feared over, was the practice of coming down out of the mountains, kidnapping women, and bringing them back to their homes to make them wives. So one has to wonder if these Indian devils were really just Whilkut men coming down and taking the Yurok women to avoid inbreeding and then going back up into the mountains, especially when you consider the possible relation to this disappearing Naha tribe. Now, of course, there is the wrinkle that the Nakani were described in one instance as terrible wild men with red eyes and of enormous height completely covered in long hair, but here's the thing. After the Battle of Ape Canyon in 1924, stories began to run about these ape men who lived up in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. And it was said that in the old Indian legends, these were referred to as Si-Te-Cah or Si-Te-Cah or, in one case, Tayao. Now, I will point out the similarity between Si-Te-Cah and Si-Te-Cah, but I don't think that it's necessarily anything. I just noticed it. In a 1924 article, a Marion Lambert of Sequim, Washington, recounted a Skokomish story of a woman who was stolen away from her home by one of the Tayaups, and that she was brought into the wild and lived amongst the wild men, and when she was allowed to return home to visit, she told them, all about her story, that she had had a son with them, and, the son was wild too. And if you'll recall, our previous video on this subject, that's very similar to Lucy Thompson's story. The only difference is that in Marion Lambert's version, at the end, the woman decides that she wants to go back and live with her husband, rather than staying in the village the way that Lucy Thompson's story ends. In addition to that, a Jorg Totski of the Klallam tribe penned an article for the July 15, 1924 issue of the Oregonian, in which he argued that the attackers at Ape Canyon were in fact the Si-Te-Cah tribe, and Ape Canyon is just east of Mount St. Helens for reference. He gave a description of these strange people, and he cited Henry Napoleon of the Klallam, Peter James of the Lummi, and George Kiasman of the Quinault for references. Now, according to Totski, these beings, the Si-Te-Cah, were at least 7 feet tall, though they could grow as tall as 8 feet, and their bodies were covered in hair like a bear. However, despite this stature, Totski says that they didn't hunt using weapons, but rather hypnosis and paralysis, and that they were also skilled ventriloquists, able to throw their voice all over the place. He also says that they lived up in the mountains, which of course would account for the amount of hair on their bodies, and that they would come down into the lowlands to raid other tribes for, you guessed it, wives. Now, as for the specific mountains, they're said to live in the heartland of Vancouver Island, and some are also said to live in, not on, in Mount Rainier. He also tells us that they could perfectly easily speak the Klallam language as well as several other Native American languages from the region, but that they had also mastered all of the bird calls of the Pacific Northwest, and they would use these to communicate as well. One of the men cited by Jorg Totski, the Henry Napoleon fellow, said that he had actually encountered the Si-Te-Cah once while he was visiting family in British Columbia. He said that he was hunting out near Duncan when he came across what at first he believed to be a large bear. As you may have noticed, bears mistaken for people and people mistaken for bears, very common in these stories. Now, of course, he was out hunting, so he went to shoot the bear, but before he could, he said that the thing stood and spoke to him in the Klallam tongue. And he described this creature as being about 7 feet tall and very hairy. This giant, as it's called, invited Henry back to its home, and then they followed a trail through the woods before coming to an underground trail, which led to the dwelling place of this Si-Te-Cah tribe. And Henry went on to say that while there, he was treated with every courtesy, that they were very kind to him, that he was well provided for, he wasn't threatened, any of that. And he said that they told him about their way of life. And I do really quickly, as an aside, want to mention that in Lucy Thompson's account of Oslaco's story, it was said that she was treated with courtesy and they gave her lavish gifts and, she was given all of these Indian treasures. But anyway, back to Henry Napoleon's story, he says that these Si-Te-Cah spent their winters on Vancouver Island in various caves, where they slept like bears, so I assume that means some form of hibernation. I probably should have looked into what hibernation actually is, because I don't know about you, Aiden, but for me, I grew up thinking that hibernation, the bears literally just slept for like 3 months straight, and I guess that's not how it works.
Yeah, I got yelled at, I feel like in the last couple of years, for, like, literally yelled at for somehow not knowing that hibernation wasn't just, like, a long nap.
Yeah, I don't totally understand how it works, probably should have looked it up. You know what, I'm going to look it up. So we did some quick research, and it appears that for the most part, hibernation is kind of just taking a very long nap, but that sometimes they do get up and go do things, and they live off of stored fat reserves and whatnot, which, of course, if we look at what was said about the Nakani, that they lived off of stored food from their underground homes in the mountains during the winter. But anyway, they would live at these homes during the winter, and then when spring came, they would migrate, probably following the food, and he says that this would be an interesting path. He says they would migrate through the mountains, coming out at Mount Rainier, then going to Mount St. Helens, and then home. And the way that's described, it sounds more like they're traveling underground than it does that they're traveling over land. Because you can't come out of the mountains at Mount Rainier and then proceed to Mount St. Helens. If you are coming through the mountains continue between Mount Rainier and Mount St. Helens. In order to come out of the mountains and then go to Mount St. Helens, you'd have to make this weird out-of-the-way trek around the flatlands to the west and then up Mount St. Helens. And the thing is, the way they go home is they don't retrace their steps back up. They go west up through the Olympic Mountains and then cross the bay back to Vancouver Island. Now, it could be that I'm just misreading this, but the way it's written, it really does sound to me like between the underground trail that's mentioned and the weird phrasing of coming out of the mountain and then going through more mountains, I'm thinking they might be traveling underground through underground passageways and then coming out at Mount Rainier going overland to Mount St. Helens. And Henry finishes his story by saying that the Sasq'ets would rub strange medicine on their bodies, which would turn them invisible, which is why they were rarely seen. It matches up extremely well with Marion Lambert's account of the tie-ups, and the only disparity is that while Toski suggests that these Sasq'ets creatures, that they are naturally covered in hair, Marion Lambert says that they're not actually covered in hair, that this is a clothing item, that they wear furs either to deal with the cold or as camouflage when they're out hunting. And according to her, this came from, a Skokomish source. It also lines up remarkably well, however, with the Sasq'ets stories recounted by J.W. Burns, as well as these beings that are in the Plateau culture that are called Si-Te-Cah or stick shower Indians. Now, this following bit is according to the anthropologist Lucullus Virgil McWhorter, which is one hell of a name, who described these people as of comparable size to normal humans, who could perfectly mimic bird calls, throw voices, and were nocturnal. Additionally, they lived in underground lodges in the mountains, were seldom seen, and would come to the lowlands to hunt for food that they would not eat but rather dry cure. Sort of sounds kind of like the Mahoney from the Gwich'in tribes, don't it? Also, just a little interesting bit that may in some ways corroborate this, although it may mean something else. On a lot of early maps of America, you'll see on some I should say, you'll see phrasing that says they live in the way of the Tartars. And this could refer to the Tartar or Eurasian steppe culture practice of eating raw meat. What it certainly doesn't mean is that it was part of some great Tartarian empire. That did not exist. It is not real. Now, interestingly enough, the Si-Te-Cah were also said to use a medicine, which made them fast and strong, like meth, and in some stories, they're said to kidnap children and raise them as their own. In my opinion, when you start to look at the Sasq'ets and the Sasq'ets and the Si-Te-Cah, that's when you start to see things really connect. These are some very, very interlinked concepts, and it's hard to say for sure why, but it's also hard to ignore the clear connections. And honestly, I wasn't really sure what to think going into the research for this video, for this topic as a whole. I wasn't sure what I was going to find, would there actually be links? Would these all be things that on their face seem similar, but in reality, it's just one or two little things? But what really stuck out to me was the seeming inextricable link between the concept of Bigfoot and the concept of Wildmen. And while uncovering these various Bigfoot legends from across the continent in the last two videos that we made, I found that it was rare that any two were perfect matches. There were certain characteristics that just kept popping up again and again. In nearly every version we looked at, this figure, this creature, these Wildmen, whatever they are, they're described as being between 6.5 and 8 feet tall. The sole exception to this is the Yurok Indian Devil. Now, it's never explicitly stated how large these people are, it's just that Lucy Thompson suggests they're very strong. Another common trait is the presence of hair all over their bodies, which is missing only from the descriptions of the Algic Indian Devil and Wendigo and the Numic cannibal giants. And of course, these cannibal giants should not be confused with the Si-Te-Cah, who appear to be just a distinct group, a distinct tribe of Native Americans, perhaps ancestors or cousins of the Nez Perce. The second most common trait was actually the ability to speak human languages, which was present in every single one except for the stories of the Nantiinaq and the Muskogean Esti-Kipkaki. It should be clarified, however, that the opposite is not said in any point in either of the stories. It's never said these things can't speak human language, it's just never explicitly stated that they can. Additionally, there's exactly 4 paragraphs written on the Esti-Kipkaki that I could find from any legitimate source, so it's hard to say what that guy actually is. The other communicative method that's frequently brought up is the use of bird calls and ventriloquism, which is absent from the Numic man-eaters, the Wendigo, the Nantiinaq, and of course the Esti-Kipkaki. I will say the Wendigo bit I'm iffy on there, because I feel like I remember reading stories and accounts where the Wendigo was able to mimic voices and throw its voice and all of that, but I couldn't find them while doing the research, so I don't want to say it with any certainty, but I do feel like I remember there being something about the Wendigo being able to do this. Then again, the Wendigo is such a force in pop culture that I may just be misremembering something from Supernatural as something I read. Caves do seem to be the dwelling place of choice, explicitly mentioned in all but the stories of the Wendigo, Nantiinaq, and Si-Te-Cah, and the Wendigo legend is so broad that I have found accounts where you have Wendigos that live underground, you have some that live out in the wild, you have some that even have houses. So it varies so much that it's hard to say with the Wendigo specifically. The Wendigo also appears to sort of be two different monsters and concepts, where one is a giant and one is a regular man. We might have to go back and do a full video on the Wendigo again using the book I just ordered that actually was written by an Ojibwe scholar. I've been using Basil H. Johnston for what's available of his on the internet for a rather long time, but I finally just bit the bullet and ordered his book because you can never find the whole thing online, so it seemed appropriate to go with that. And speaking of the Wendigo, which really only matches with all of this about half the time, we gotta go over the cannibalism and violence aspect. Cannibalism, or at the very least the propensity for violence towards humans, is mentioned in all but two versions here. Those being the Yurok Indian devil, who seems to prefer to marry people rather than eat them, and the Si-Te-Cah, because absolutely nobody knows anything about that guy. That said, the Sasq'ets and Si-Te-Cah seem to only become violent when provoked, although that may change if we assume that the Si-Te-Cah is just the plateau version of these things and that they're all describing the exact same legend. I say this because the Si-Te-Cah have a tendency to waylay travelers. They aren't known to kill people frequently, but it's said that, they would trick you around a little bit, beat you over the head, and take your stuff. And sometimes in tandem with that violence aspect is the kidnapping aspect, that these people are known to either go down and kidnap women to take for marriage, or raise children as their own. Only the Si-Te-Cah and Nantiinaq stories lacked this aspect. Finally, there are the hypnosis and paralysis parts, which only show up in the Numic and Salishan versions. So, with all of that context given, let's recap. Unusual size and strength, body hair, cave dwelling, kidnapping, and the capability to speak human language are by far the most common traits, while hypnosis was rather rare. And then if we look at our sample pool of creatures here, most of them matched only 4 to 6 of the 8 characteristics, with the Si-Te-Cah matching only 3. The Sasq'ets and the Si-Te-Cah, however, matched every single descriptor here. And for that reason, I feel that we must name them the sassiest squatch. But of course what we're doing here is not trying to determine the sassiest squatch. I mean, that was the goal of this video. But what I really wanted to do with this series, what I'm currently doing with this series, is trying to investigate, as much about Bigfoot as we can put together in one place, from as many legitimate sources as I can find. In going and trying to get a primer for this series and looking at the Bigfoot content that's out there, one thing that I saw again and again is that a lot of the time there will be a claim, but that claim there's no citation for it, or the claim is just simply incorrect, that a lot of people are working with information that simply isn't reliable, and when you're trying to get to the bottom of something, when you're trying to find the truth, you need to make sure that the foundations you're working with are accurate. So to that end, our goal with this series is to provide, the layout. What is Bigfoot? What are all the facts that we can possibly compile, or at least the most important ones? And then we'll do an analysis at the end of it that gives our opinion, but we want you guys to have your own, resources, your own way of looking at something, having a jumping off point if this is something you're interested in researching too. So of course, I'm not going to give a conclusion yet. We're not done. In the next episode of this series, we're going to be looking at frontiersman tales and how do those tie into the folk legends, and how were those reported in the papers before 1900, things like that. And of course, we're going to be taking a look at Teddy Roosevelt's Bowman story, because that's just weird. As I said throughout the video, we are always interested in hearing people's perspectives. If you think we got something wrong, if you think there's something we missed that you'd like us to take a look at, or if you just want to give feedback, feel free to leave something in the comments. Go ahead, discuss amongst yourselves. We just appreciate seeing the community do its thing. And if you want to support what we're doing here at the Lore Lodge, you can subscribe to us on Patreon for just $1 a month. We have Drunk Folklore / History coming back as a live program. It will be once a month. Aiden, did we decide on a startup date for that?
Should be... We do last week of the month, right?
I think that was the idea.
So it should be the last Friday of April.
Last Friday of April, folks, on the Lore Lodge Patreon, and if you're a YouTube member, you will also get access. YouTube channel memberships are $5. We're considering revamping the membership structure on here, but right now we have a lot of irons in the fire. You can also support us by drinking our coffee from Tableau Roasting Company. It's called Mount Pocono Perk, and I designed it myself. I actually do, in fact, drink it every day, and it's not because I get it for free. Wawa coffee is cheap. I drink this instead. We also are still in talks, but getting much closer to finalizing a deal to bring our merch to Bunker Branding. So we will soon have a revamped merch shop for you guys where you'll be able to get really, really nice stuff. If you want to support our other endeavors, we do have more channels. The Weird Bible is back. It will be the last Thursday of every month that you'll see that, and then the very next day you get Drunk History. It works out great. We also have the History Hut, which I'm trying to figure out how to work in time to make content for. And we have a couple of other channels. One is the Lore Lounge over there. We'll be doing some just, casual hangout kind of podcasts. And we have my personal channel, Aiden Mattis, where I do reaction streams, music streams. I play video games over there. We've been playing a lot of Helldivers. You might have heard Ella whine a minute ago. She's just hanging out under the desk. I used to do that. And of course, we have our live show, which will be returning at the end of this month of March, with the rebranded name, The Lore Lads, and we'll have a much better setup, better equipment. We'll be bringing on guests every other week, and then the weeks that we're not bringing on guests, he and I will be sitting at the table together talking about what we covered. If you would like to get some of the last run of the merch we currently have, you should be able to get it through the little boxes of merch that are under this video on YouTube. I would tell you to go to the URL, but Spring just kind of screwed us, so you can really only buy it through YouTube right now, but go ahead and do that if you would like to, because that stuff won't be coming back. The best way to get updates as to what this channel is up to, what's coming next, and to interact with the community is to join our Discord server. That can be done by going to bit.ly/jointhelodge and just becoming a member of the server. It's free to join. Ella's telling me the video's over, so I gotta end the video. Anyway, I'm Aiden Madison. Thanks for stopping by the Lore Lodge.